Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I'm delighted to be here at this conference, and thank you all very much for coming to what I certainly promises to be a very stimulating and productive event. I think we have already kind of sort of preface what I'm going to be saying. But that was very, very useful. You've done it very nicely. Looking at the conference program, the first thing that struck me was the title of this conference, a historical understanding of a new community. My immediate response was, in what sense could British Muslims be construed as a community, and how new is it? My talk today will engage with these two questions by offering my thoughts on how British Muslim histories, in the plural, have taken shape in recent decades. Writing the histories of Muslims into the history of Britain has been a lengthy process and a complex process. Like most historiographical enterprises, it has not been a straightforward linear exercise. In many ways, the subject for exploration, British Muslims, had to be tracked down and named, with this really only starting to happen once Britain's increasingly diverse Muslim communities had gained sufficient numbers to trigger questions about how they and their families and their religious traditions had become part of the fabric of British society. History, in this context, has provided the ways and means to understand the present better, to make sense of both its neat and its messy dimensions, and to show that Muslim individuals and communities, whether long established or relative newcomers, form part of a tradition that had been present in the British Isles for centuries. From as far back as the medieval period, Muslims constituted a presence which over time rooted itself irreversibly across the country, spreading outwards first from port cities such as London and Liverpool, and later in the northern mill towns to become part and parcel of Britain's everyday diverse reality. Key to this growing presence, of course, was Britain's global empire, which connected huge numbers of Muslims from around the world with the imperial mother country. And then, in similar fashion, the ending of the empire, which helped to trigger migration on a substantial scale. Again, understanding and appreciating the importance of these imperial and post-colonial connections has become central to the writing of British Muslim histories. History, however, is very often driven by the desire to recover a personal connectivity with the past, and likewise to identify human connections between people living now and then. Much writing about the presence of Muslims in Britain has been spurred on by this ambition to identify earlier pioneering generations who carved out space for later Muslims to fill. Whether these were Ottoman or Persian plenipotentiaries paying court to British monarchs, or hard-working Lascars who made up a substantial proportion of the crews that kept the British Empire afloat, or enterprising peddlers selling their wares in interwar Scotland, pinpointing their predecessors in earlier times makes it easier to explain their presence now. Take the ongoing centenary commemorations of the First World War. The fact that hundreds of thousands of Muslim soldiers, mostly but not exclusively hailing from the British-controlled India, fought and died in that conflict has connected many Muslims in this country to Britain's wider history in ways that have been aimed at building confidence and trust across community divisions and misunderstandings. In this respect, history is not a neutral player, but rather testifies to the old saying that, and this is George Orwell, whosoever controls the past controls the present. But the writing of British Muslim histories has its own history, and we can see clear patterns in how it has taken shape. For instance, in the early to mid-1980s, diasporic communities, Muslim or otherwise, were still largely identified and analyzed using ethnic and racial categories. Key studies such as Rosina Visram's Asians in Britain, 400 Years of History, published in 1986, thus framed and subsumed Muslims under particular ethnic and regional identities, in this case, the Indian subcontinent. Even Fred Halliday, An Arab Community in Exile, 1992, and later Richard Lawless, From Ties to Tyneside, 1995, whose primary focus were diasporic Muslim communities, elided their subjects' religious affiliations and framed them primarily in ethnic terms as Arabs. All the same, these pioneering historical studies shed valuable light on the realities of the Muslim presence. They filled in gaps on our collective knowledge and broadened our understanding of the diversity of this presence. Visram, for instance, while painstakingly examining the centuries-long nature and pattern of South Asian migrants, encompassing, among others, servants, ayahs, students, princes, soldiers, professionals, and entrepreneurs, and studying official attitudes to their settlement, the reactions and perceptions of the British people to them, and the responses of the South Asians themselves to their experiences, also took account of their frequent Muslim identities. Some 20 years later, Michael Fisher, in his 2004 Counterflows to Colonialism, Indian Travelers and Settlers in Britain, and more recently, A South Asian History of Britain, similarly located a Muslim presence within the wider histories of South Asians coming to Britain. In his very interesting history, Fisher chronologically analyzed how far race and gender affected the lives of diverse groups of South Asian Muslims over centuries. Both Visram and Fisher, therefore, by excavating scattered archives and deploying a very full range of research modalities, wove rich narratives, throwing new light on the diverse and historically complex evolution of particular groups of Muslims in Britain. Given the breadth of the periods covered, piecing together coherent and incisive narratives from rare primary sources, contemporary travelogues and memoirs, letters and diaries, their work, albeit separated by a couple of decades, has illuminated the richness of these particular experiences vividly. For me, however, the main strength of these historical explorations lies in how they extend and deepen our understanding of key dimensions of the Muslim presence in Britain. First, they tell us stories about Muslim status, struggles, and scope for advancement in the dramatically changing relationship between their lands of origin and their new homeland. And how, over the advent, expansion, and the end of colonialism, Muslims, in these cases as part of the South Asian diaspora, living here moved from being rare and exotic outsiders to integral components of British society. Through them, we come to understand how the relationship between a people from the most powerful empire of his day and a relatively poor and divided island gradually reversed over the centuries. How attitudes in Britain towards Muslims gradually changed as Britain gained military, political, and economic ascendancy over them. We are introduced to the processes that resulted in the transformation of British perceptions from those characterized by curiosity, open-mindedness, lack of condescension, and respect for South Asian Muslims and their cultures during the 18th and the earlier part of the 19th century, to those marked by increasing ambiguity, racial arrogance, and indeed contempt, born of imperial rule, and so on. How the scope for self-representation, much in evidence in the 18th century, became increasingly limited as negative British stereotypes about them developed. Second, by looking at representation of South Asian Muslims in British popular culture and the effect of this on British treatment of them, by considering the intersection of race and class in shaping Anglo-Indian relations, and by examining the construction of English and Indian identities in reaction to their experience, historians like Wistrom and Fisher offer subtle understandings of the dynamics of British culture and the extent to which it has evolved as a result of the changing racial and cultural mix of British society. Indeed, it would seem that the thoughts that the British population had regarding the damaging effects of becoming a multicultural and multi-faith society had already become deeply embedded in the psyche by the end of the 19th century. In effect, by establishing the roots of our present-day concerns in the past, we are given crucial insights into why, despite much effort, negative perceptions of Muslims have proved so hard to erase. Finally, a key feature of these histories is their engagement with the theme of identity formation. They illuminate the dynamic nature of identity construction and connect with the multidimensional strategies that Muslims later pursued as they renegotiated their identities in a post-1945 environment that has become far more culturally plural than that which their predecessors encountered in the centuries and decades before the Second World War. By taking a long historical perspective, Wistrom, Fisher, and others demonstrate the role that Muslims have played in compelling a shift from a largely exclusivist notion of Britishness to more inclusive, hybridizing alternatives that offer a greater measure of dignity and respect for all British citizens. But equally, such studies are mindful not to paint too simplistic a picture of what has been checkered histories. Histories that require a nuanced approach in order to establish a contextualized understanding of the interaction between Muslims and British society. Reading them, we quickly realize that throughout the centuries of Muslim-British interactions, attitudes here were neither uniform nor always necessarily negative. An excellent example of this kind of history writing that highlights the complex interplay between human agency and socio-political cultural context in shaping the character and patterns of individual and community relations is Nabil Matar's 2008 Islam in Britain. And he's going to be the one who's going to follow me this morning. So very good to have you here. Studying Anglo-Muslim interactions in the early modern period, it rigorously investigates attitudes to Islam from the reigns of Elizabeth I to Charles II. Unraveling English perceptions of Muslims in Britain, it contests persistent gaps and understandings in the existing body of literature. Contrary to Orientalist scholarship, it suggests that early modern Britain's engagement with Islam was complex, plural, and often contradictory. Where commentators have often viewed perceptions of Islam through the prism of colonialist supremacy, Matar disputes the validity of such theses for this earlier period, when Britain, as he says, did not enjoy military or industrial power over Islamic countries, which were, as he puts it, beyond colonization and domination. We learn from him that in this period, English traders, captives, travelers, and chroniclers interacted with Muslims, both on Muslim soil as well as, though less frequently, on English soil. And that, interestingly, in the late 17th century, John Locke, the great philosopher of English liberalism, sought not only toleration of the turbaned nations, the Mohammedans, but also supported granting them civil rights and British nationality. More recently, Jerry Broughton's in this Orient Isle, Elizabethan England and the Islamic world, shines a fascinating light on how the presence and interactions with Muslims in trade, diplomacy, drama shaped Elizabethan politics and culture. Niall Green's The Love of Strangers, or what 6 Muslim students learned in Jane Austen's London, an insightful account of an Anglo-Persian cross-cultural encounters in early 19th century England, too illuminates Muslim experience of England in this period. Scholarly examination of the accounts of Muslims who visited, stayed in England for considerable time, some settling here permanently, have further enriched our understanding of this history. This kind of scholarship reflects a discursive and institutional shift regarding identification and representation of Muslims in Britain that began in the late 1980s as British Muslim activists challenged the race relations framework, which in time translated into more explicit focus on the religious identity of Muslims in this country, and hence this aspect of their histories as well. In other words, the focus started to switch from ethnicity to Muslimness. The reasons for this change in focus, as you will all appreciate, were manifold, connected to the series of historical and demographic shifts that took place globally and locally in the 1980s and the 1990s and propelled the shift towards a more distinctly Muslim identity. As Muslims became more effective in mobilizing, organizing, and engaging in the public domain, thanks, for example, to the Honeyford affair in Bradford, and perhaps more significantly, the Satanic Verses controversy, they began to challenge the race relations framework. World events, particularly the perceived rise of political, religious, so-called fundamentalism in Muslim countries, and global events such as the First Gulf War, 9/11, and the War on Terror, contributed to the emergence and growth of a more selfish, self-conscious Muslimness, thrusting the British Muslim population into the academic as well as popular media spotlight. History writing came to recognize these developments. So alongside studies that tended to be more concerned with ethnic identities, addressing Muslim issues indirectly or subsuming them under other categories, historical literature from the late 1990s became much more Muslim, specific in how it examined wider societal issues, British identity, free speech, gender relations, educational rights, and political representation, among others. In the late 20th and the early 1st century context, the writing of British Muslims' histories therefore offered opportunities to challenge assumptions that pitted the modern West against the Muslim Orient, to question the supposed incompatibility of Islam with modern Britain. By studying British Muslims historically, scholars were able to problematize binary oppositions, the bifurcation between a self and another, the national and the colonial, the citizen and the alien, the secular and the religious, the modern and the traditional, the Occident and the Orient. By conceptualizing British Muslim histories as both Islamic and British Muslim histories now occupy a space in modern discourses between binary categories. As such, British Muslims' lives challenge both notions of British indigeneity and Islamic authenticity. They also complicate the notion of diaspora because many of them are converts at home in their own lands, and others are third and fourth generation British Muslims who self-identify with no land other than where they were born and now live. So in many recent studies, historians seek to capture and make sense of the relationality of the lived experiences of British Muslims, utilizing analytical concepts such as hybridity, symbiosis, syncretism, hegemony, and resistance, exploring the liminal space between the self and the other offers fertile ground for understanding identity formation that is imbricated by varying religious, ethnic, racial, gender, and national subjectivities. Accordingly, here we see British Muslims negotiating their social environments transnationally in varying historical circumstances. We witness the emergence not of one monolithic Muslim community, but various Muslim communities with different notions of Islam that stand pluralistically in relation to one another, as well as to non-Muslim communities among them, among whom they are situated. Being a little provocative, I feel that all this points to the unlikelihood of realizing an idealized, authentic Islam separate from cultural practices. Let me pursue this last point a bit further. As everyone here will appreciate, this conference's program is striking for the overwhelming number of biographical papers being presented. The lives and achievements of Joseph Morgan, Sir Thomas Roe, Yahya Parkinson, Abdullah Quilliam, and Marmaduke Pickthall are under close scrutiny this weekend. Now, while Thomas Carlyle, author of Heroes and Hero Worship, in which Muhammad was one of his heroic subjects, believed the impact of great men largely explain history, modern historians, as I have said before, have come to be more concerned with the interplay between personality and social forces. Hence, the biographies that they produce seek first and foremost to place and understand the individual in their historical context. This has resulted in the emergence of a genuinely critical tradition in this subdiscipline of historical writing. Accordingly, what we increasingly find is that historians who narrativize the lives of British Muslims are aware of the need to be as scrupulous and detached as possible in their examination and interpretation of facts about their subjects, to locate individuals in the wider framework of British society, embedding their lives in the wider sequence of events and occurrences. Mindful of the great man style of history writing, they recognize the importance of being careful that their subjects do not loom larger than life, and much of what they focus on is concerned with the analysis and interpretation of situations, events, policies, organizations on the basis of deep knowledge of the subject society, while at the same time maintaining a balance between private motives and public issues. By and large, this has produced an approach that involves a non-deterministic view of history, recognizing the existence of chance and accident in human events, believing that people are significant agents of historical change, that individuals and their actions are significant elements in human history, and therefore are a fit subject of historical inquiry. We might even suggest that scholars of British Muslim histories have tended to weave into their writing Marx's famous aphorism, quote, "Men make their own history." We're talking 19th century, so women are sort of included, I suppose, "but not of their own will, not under circumstances they themselves have chosen, but given and inherited circumstances which they are directly confronted. Circumscribed by forces of change beyond their control, their subjects' interpretation, execution, and explanation are key to understanding this history. This approach has offered a useful corrective to impersonal history, since without recourse to the people involved, it would be difficult to understand the main contours of British Muslims' past. But despite these positive developments, it is hard to ignore one fact when looking at history writing about British Muslims: the invisibility of Muslim women in historical accounts. Now, this may seem relatively unsurprising, given the tendency for women to be largely absent from the mainstream historical record. The reasons for their absence has been discussed exhaustively. After all, much history has been written by men. And the hegemony of patriarchal ideology has meant that until recently, women were usually consigned to and often remained confined in the private domestic rather than the public social sphere. This then meant that they were excluded from the very raw material, I'm talking about primary sources, archives, which are intrinsic to the writing of history. We also know that the recovering of women's past, their experiences and contributions, has been driven primarily by women historians themselves, who have had to think innovatively about how to tease out women's histories from those under which they have been subsumed, under narratives of powerful men's lives. They've had to piece these together from disparate fragments and by reading texts against the grain. British Muslim women's histories have suffered perhaps even more than most in this regard, though the field is not completely barren. Those studies that do exist reinforce the urgent need for such histories, thanks to the riches that they deliver. Take, for instance, Lady Evelyn Cobble's Pilgrimage to Mecca, published, well, it was published a long time ago, but again in 2007. What emerges from the pages of this account of her pilgrimage that she undertook in 1933 is a woman of many parts, possessing considerable vitality, intellectual curiosity, an array of interests, and a number of notable accomplishments to her credit. An intriguing mixture: mother, landowner, deer stalker, gardener, traveler, writer, socialite, Arabic speaker, and Muslim. A strong-willed woman unfettered by the constraints of class and domestic life, but above all, a seeker after enlightenment and meaning in life, though strictly on her own terms. Through her individual history, we acquire a sense of the complex nature of one woman's very private journey to Islam, as well as her particular understanding of what unorthodox engagement with her adopted religion, somewhat unorthodox. What is particularly striking is how she was able to cross gender boundaries and with relative ease, veil and unveil, mingle intimately with women and more formally with men, and hold conversations on subjects of mutual interest. And yet the book reveals an unresolved tension between Evelyn Zainab Cobbold's unequivocal sympathy for Islam and her often critical observations regarding many of its practices in the Arab world, both of which find eloquent expression in her writings. Basing herself in the rationalist modernist perspective, she presented Islam as a tolerant, peaceful, flexible, Abrahamic faith. as a liberated European woman. However, she found it extremely difficult to come to terms with Arab Muslim women's domestic seclusion, which she could never accept in her own life. Out of this personal struggle, what comes across most powerfully is her very European conception of religious belief, which to her remained a largely private matter and an individual choice. Ceremonial and ritual were not part of her Islam. Indeed, throughout her individual spiritual journey, she showed herself willing to ditch convention if or when it was inconvenient to her. But there can be no doubt about the deep sincerity of her faith. In delineating Lady Cobble's inimitable and quintessentially English pursuit of Islam, this history of her life challenges us to investigate alternatives to hegemonizing Islamic perspectives and practices. Take the two biographies of the arguably better known Nur-un Nisa Inayat Khan, Madeleine by Jean Overton Fuller and published in 1952, Spy Princess 2007. Both tell us about the life and achievements of a remarkable Muslim woman in the first half of the 20th century, though written half a century apart to do so in different ways. Codenamed Madeleine, Noor was the eldest daughter of Maulvi Inayat Khan, a Sufi musician and preacher of Islamic mysticism from Bhopal in India, based in London and Paris in early 20th century. Growing up in an atmosphere that mixed religion with art, she showed considerable promise in Indian music, Indian dance, as well as in writing poetry and composing little melodies. After her father's death, she moved from Paris to London and joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in November, in the middle of the war, 1940. Having been subsequently recruited by the Special Operations Executive, she was dropped in occupied France in 1943 to gather military intelligence. Betrayed to the Germans, she was arrested in October 1943 and transferred to the Dachau concentration camp. There she was tortured, but showing immense courage, refused to divulge her radio codes. Having attempted escape twice, she was declared highly dangerous and shackled in chains. In 1944, she was transferred to Dachau concentration camp, shot in the back of her neck, and burnt in a crematorium oven. She was one of the few Muslim people, the only Muslim woman, to be awarded the George Cross as well as a Croix de Guerre with Gold Star, the highest British and French awards for non-combat gallantry. In 2012, long after her death, she was finally honored when a memorial to her was raised in London's Gordon Square, recognizing her heroism and sacrifice. These narratives, life histories of two women, are particularly notable for how they defy dominant discourses present in British society regarding Muslim gender roles, challenging understandings of Islamic relations as oppressive and backward, and offering fresh perspectives and creative possibilities regarding British Muslim women crossing established boundaries. We need more histories of British Muslim women, and we need them to figure more prominently in the way that broader British histories are written. One of the reasons why I felt a great urge to write The Infidel Within back in the early 2000s was because I wanted to challenge widely held perceptions about British Muslims. One of these perceptions, or misperceptions, was that they lacked roots in Britain, that they had arrived here only recently, and so could claim no deep historical and organic links with the so-called customs, traditions, and values of British society. Such perceptions, a decade later, are unfortunately still widespread, damaging for community harmony, since they are often deployed to set boundaries that arguably categorize, alienate, and exclude Muslims by calling into question their emotional ties, loyalties, and claims of belonging to this country. A version of this is our country, and by implication, not yours. The claims to greater entitlement are frequently, if not always, explicitly asserted. In this discourse, British Muslims continue to be viewed as a huge problem in need of a solution. The difficulty facing those of us who seek to write their histories, therefore, is that British Muslims have come to be inaccurately portrayed as undifferentiated isolationists opposed to modern secular norms and values and immune to processes of change. Perceived so often as homogeneous and monolithic, British Muslims present a range of negative stereotypes which militate against constructive and harmonious interaction. Instead of mutual goodwill, we find division, distrust, and, unfortunately, Islamophobia. But when we look at British Muslims' histories, their most striking aspect is arguably the diversity and dynamism that they capture, as reflected in the wide range of distinct cultures, languages, and political traditions that we find around us: South Asian, Middle Eastern, African, and increasingly European. Accordingly, I believe that a historical consideration, by pluralizing their presence, has helped us to dismantle at least some of these popular or widespread imaginings of British Muslims. Moreover, exploring the historical evolution of Britain's Muslim communities helps to identify and so demonstrate their rootedness and cements their equal entitlements and claims in British society. And in this regard, it is Ron Jeeves, who is with us today, and Jamie Gillam, and Muhammad Siddiq Seton, who's also with us today. Their pioneering, rigorous, and nuanced research is what has deepened our understanding. So to conclude, then, what writing British history, Muslims' histories has done, and is successfully doing, is uncovering the experiences of particular communities which have hitherto remained marginalized, subordinated, if not entirely excluded from studies of the British past. This writing has striven to give a voice to those who seemed previously to be lost in time, whose lived experience was thought to be of little or no interest, but whose pasts, in the context of the presence of millions of heterogeneous Muslims in a plural Britain today, can no longer be ignored. But even more saliently, by mapping the overlapping contours and fault lines of Muslim identity and experience in an age of demographic transition and settlement, it has given us tools for imagining and constructing alternative pasts and alternative presents. Thank you.